You build schools that members, students cannot attend, but you raise money from members to build that school.
When a pastor stands up in a pulpit and names other ministers as Yahoo Pastors, you know the air around the church is about to crack.
Where their children cannot attend. What is that not Yahoo?
That's exactly what happened when Pastor Abel Damina aimed a blistering rebuke at two of Nigeria's most visible church leaders, Pastor W.F. Kumuyi on one side and Bishop David Oyedepo on the other.
You build schools that members, students cannot attend, but you raise money from members to build that school. Oppression. What is different between that and slave trade? What's the difference? You raise money, and you tell them we want to build a school so our children can have a school to attend, You raise their money and they all contributed. You built the school and put the school fees where their children cannot attend. What is that not Yahoo? Wait, is that not Yahoo? It's Yahoo. It's not even Yahoo. It's Yahoo.
The phrase he used didn't tiptoe around nuance, it landed with force. For many people listening, it felt like a volcanic moment, not just another line in a sermon, but a direct challenge to how certain ministries spend money, raise funds, and define their priorities. This is the kind of sermon that does more than raise eyebrows. It interrupts the comfortable assumptions many of us carry about church projects being inherently holy, beyond question. Damina was not only criticizing specific projects, he was naming a broader ethical problem. Building institutions with members' money that, in his view, those same members cannot realistically use. He painted a picture of poor congregants sacrificially funding grand schools, while their children are priced out of the very institutions they helped create. That claim, raw, personal, and visibly angry, is what sent shockwaves through social media, WhatsApp groups, and pulpit conversations across the country. Now, let's be careful to separate the claim from the man. This is Pastor Abel Damina's charge. He is a pastor with a prophetic, often confrontational style, and he has never been shy about slamming what he sees as abuse in Christian leadership. So when he said, "They are Yahoo pastors," he wasn't issuing a neutral critique. He was leveling a moral indictment, that fundraising for those schools was fraudulent or at least unethical when the economic realities of the average congregant were ignored. That's a heavy charge. It is the kind of language that forces the church to look in the mirror. So what exactly was he accusing them of? At the heart of Damina's argument is a simple, uncomfortable question. Who benefits from the institutions we build with church money? He argues that the answer in many cases is, not the average member. The allegation is threefold. First, he says that members, many of them poor, were asked to contribute to the building funds. Second, those contributions were pooled to create top-tier private universities and schools, institutions that operate on fee structures most of those members cannot afford. Third, when the gates open and tuition bills go out, those who gave sacrificially to the construction are left outside the classroom, unable to enroll their own children without significant hardship. Think about that dynamic for a moment. If true, it creates a tension between sacrifice and return. People are told, give sacrificially for the work of God, help build a legacy, support an institution that will advance the gospel, leave your mark on history. They give tithes, offerings, special building fund gifts, expecting that God will honor their sacrifice. But when the product of that sacrifice becomes inaccessible to them, the moral question naturally follows. Did the church build for the people or for prestige? Did it build to bless the flock, or to build an elite citadel that serves a different constituency? That's the core of Damina's accusation, and why he used such ugly language. He's pointing to what he sees as a systemic dictionarying of the poor, a situation where the poor finance luxuries that enrich institutions and perhaps leaders, but don't materially benefit from them. For many listeners, that hits a nerve because it cuts across two raw spots, the reality of widespread poverty and the deep desire for church leaders to be above reproach when it comes to the stewardship of members' resources. Bishop David Oyedepo's Covenant University and Landmark University have become marquee brands in Nigerian private education. They're associated with high standards, disciplined campuses, and an unapologetic Christian ethos. Covenant University, in particular, has been widely publicized for its academic standards and for producing graduates who perform strongly in the marketplace. Likewise, Pastor W.F. Kumuyi has been central to the Deeper Life movement and to the establishment of schools such as Deeper Life High School and Anchor University. These are institutions with strong reputations, academic track records, and in many cases, proud alumni. But here's the tension: prestige and affordability do not always travel together. Building and maintaining a university, classrooms, laboratories, faculty salaries, accreditation requirements, libraries, hostels, ICT infrastructure, costs money. To sustain high standards, private universities in Nigeria generally charge significant fees. The same is true for private secondary schools that aim for excellence. The result is a system that often prices out the majority of people who attend and fund the church. So Damina's rhetorical question, why build schools members can't afford, asks whether the church has a moral obligation to structure its educational projects differently. This is not simply a matter of envy against success. We must acknowledge two realities simultaneously. On the one hand, these universities have created opportunities for thousands of young people, provided employment for many, and created platforms for intellectual formation rooted in Christian values. They have status and influence, and many alumni would testify to life-changing outcomes. On the other hand, there is a perception, powerfully voiced by Damina, that the beneficiaries are not necessarily the grassroots members who contributed sacrificially in decades past. Why does this perception grow so quickly? Because of a basic human logic. When people give sacrificially for a cause, especially in a church context where giving is often emotional and spiritual, they expect some fruit that is broadly accessible. When the visible fruit of their sacrifice, a university or a school, becomes an elite product that seems designed for a different demographic, suspicion grows. And suspicion breeds sharp words. So how do defenders of these institutions respond? Supporters of Oyedepo and Kumuyi point to the long list of positive outcomes: leadership formation, skilled graduates, scholarship programs, community development, job creation, and the testimony of many who have benefited. They argue that private schools are expensive because excellence is expensive, that the alternative, cutting corners, would only undermine the quality and long-term sustainability of the project, and that revenue from these institutions often funds wider ministry initiatives including hospitals, missions, and other social projects that benefit the wider community. This is an important argument. The defenders say, you don't criticize the only sustainable model that preserves quality. Instead, you work to ensure that the institutions include provisions for the poor, scholarship funds, bursaries, merit-based aid, outreach programs. They remind critics that running a university is not the same as building a church auditorium. The recurring operational costs and regulatory demands are significant. If you want a high-standard educational institution that raises graduates who can compete globally, you must fund it in ways that allow it to attract and retain qualified faculty and to build the necessary infrastructure. But Damina's critique is less about the inevitability of cost and more about transparency and justice. He is asking whether the funding model fairly balances sacrifice and access. Did the leadership put mechanisms in place so the average member could benefit? Were there endowments, sliding scales, or community scholarships targeted specifically at church members? Or did the visible rewards accrue to an emerging middle class and to those who could already afford private education? That question leads us back to the ethics of stewardship. Churches are fiduciaries. When they collect money in the name of God's work, they are entrusted with resources meant to serve the flock and the mission. If a church chooses to invest in a university, it must simultaneously create means to ensure that the church's own people are not excluded from the harvest of their giving. This is a practical, managerial responsibility as much as it is a theological one. One practical model that often gets overlooked in these debates is the idea of cross-subsidization and endowment building. Some of the most respected philanthropic universities globally maintain endowments and scholarship portfolios that explicitly reserve seats and funds for lower-income communities, including those who helped fund the school historically. The question for Nigerian megachurch projects then becomes, did the builders plan for an endowment to make the school accessible to their base? Or did they primarily chase sustainability through full-fee paying students? And if the latter is the reality, then Damina's rhetorical fury finds its moral grounding. He is not simply attacking success, he is asking for moral coherence. If the church takes money from poor people and uses it to build elite institutions without creating paths of access for those same poor people, a legitimate ethical problem exists. Finally, consider the narrative effect. When a church-owned university or school consistently enrolls students from well-off families, while ordinary church members struggle to pay school fees for their children, the optics look bad. Even if the institution is doctrinally and academically sound, perception matters in ministry. The body of Christ, and the watching world, expect charity and justice in how sacred resources are used. When those expectations are unmet, critics like Damina will use sharp language to wake the church up. So where does this leave us as listeners, as church members, and as citizens? In these opening 3 sections we've unpacked the rhetorical bomb that Damina dropped, The core of his accusation about inaccessible schools built with members' money, and the tension between the prestige of Oyedepo's educational empire and questions of affordability and justice. The moment is raw, the lines are drawn, and the debate is not simply about money or education, it's about the soul of stewardship in the modern church. Kumuyi's case, Deeper Life High School and Anchor University. When Pastor Abel Damina sharpened his words, he didn't name vague institutions, he pointed to concrete examples. W.F. Kumuyi's movement is associated with schools like the Deeper Life High School and the more recent Anchor University. These are institutions built explicitly to provide education with a Christian ethos, disciplined campuses, moral codes, and curriculum framed within a worldview many parents find attractive. For followers, the idea of having a school rooted in the same convictions they hold is deeply appealing. But building a school is different from running weekend services. Schools require ongoing, recurring expenses, qualified teachers, laboratories, libraries, safety and sanitation, accreditation compliance, technology, and, for universities, research support and postgraduate programs. Those things cost real money. That is why many private institutions charge fees that look steep to ordinary households. It's also why most private universities globally charge more than public ones. They're covering costs that governments subsidize elsewhere. Here is Damina's specific sting. He claims that, in many cases, the money used to establish and expand those schools came, at least in part, from the sacrificial giving of ordinary church members. Men and women with limited means were encouraged to support kingdom projects, and they did. Yet when the school opened its doors and fees were announced, many of those same givers discovered that the tuition was outside their reach. They gave to the dream. They could not enroll their own children in the reality. That scenario fuels a natural human and spiritual grievance. If you donate toward the building of something, and that thing becomes an exclusive club you cannot enter, you feel bypassed. It feels like planting a tree that you cannot climb. The question at the heart of Kumuyi's case, as Damina frames it, is straightforward. Was the school built first and foremost to bless the membership and the community that financed it, or was it constructed to create a center of excellence whose beneficiaries would mostly be those who could already afford quality private education? Supporters of Kumuyi answer that these institutions serve a wider kingdom purpose. They point to scholarship schemes, outreach initiatives, and the thousands of students who have been trained under Christian values and are now leaders in business, medicine, education, and more. They say, these schools are not merely for church members, they form part of a national contribution, producing professionals who lead with integrity in society. There is truth in that defense. Quality education produces ripple effects beyond a single congregation. But the perception remains. For the poor church member who scraped together offerings to fund a chapel, then to see a university license and a campus that feels distant, the optic sting. This is where the moral argument becomes political and pastoral at the same time. Leaders must account for both strategic impact and social equity among those who gave sacrificially. The debate, church schools, mission or business. This is the moment when the conversation becomes doctrinal, managerial and ethical all at once. The debate breaks down into two broad camps, but with nuance between them. On one side, proponents argue from a pragmatic and sometimes theological position. If the church is going to shape the next generation, it must do so at the highest possible standard. Quality requires investment. If a university hopes to compete on a national or global scale, it must recruit qualified faculty, provide modern laboratories, meet accreditation standards, and maintain infrastructure. These demands require revenue. Private education is not charity, it is a professional service that carries recurring costs. If the church aims to produce graduates who can transform society and hold their own in global markets, then charging fees that sustain quality is necessary. Proponents also point to the long-term returns, employment creation, scholarships, community development, and sometimes, profits that fund other mission works. On the other side, critics insist that when churches solicit money from congregations, especially members of modest means, there is a moral obligation to make sure the outcome directly benefits those contributors. The critics' core claim is not that excellence is a bad aim, it's that the burden of achieving it should not fall disproportionately on the poorest. If you build a premium institution on the backs of small givers, you should include robust avenues for those givers and their families to access the school, whether through reserved scholarship slots, sliding fee scales, subsidized hostels, or community quotas. Otherwise, the project risks becoming an exclusionary monument rather than a communal blessing. Between those two poles lies the uncomfortable reality: charity and sustainability must be held in tension. A purely charitable model that cannot sustain itself will collapse and fail those it intended to help. A purely market model that ignores the plight of original benefactors will breed moral outrage. The responsible solution is hybrid. Design institutions that meet high standards, but embed deliberate mechanisms to honor and support membership. An endowment for member scholarships, transparent reporting on fund allocation, guaranteed access pathways for low-income contributors, and clear governance structures that include member representation. This is not just management speak. It is an ethical architecture. If your institution is genuinely a kingdom investment, your stewardship model must demonstrate that the kingdom includes the poor, not only the elite. Damian's harsh label, Yahoo Pastors. Now we come to language and its consequences. When Abel Damina called these leaders Yahoo Pastors, he reached for a phrase that would not be ignored. The term is charged, accusatory, and deliberately provocative. He intended to shock, to break the complacency of an audience that may have become accustomed to polished project launches and glossy photo spreads. But what did he mean, and what are the implications? At its core, the phrase was meant to accusing of moral bankruptcy, of building facades that mask exploitative practices. Damina's rhetorical strategy is prophetic confrontation. Shock the conscience so the church will reform. His supporters applaud him for speaking the hard, unpalatable truth that many insiders whisper but few dare to say in public. To these admirers, Damina is a watchdog, a prophetic voice reminding leaders that ministry without justice is hypocrisy. Critics of Damina, however, see a different picture. They argue that such language is incendiary and can be divisive. They say it flattens complex issues into name-calling, risking reputational damage and fueling tribalism within the body of Christ. Some accuse Damina of jealousy or of misrepresenting the intentions of the school founders. Others see his tone as pastoral malpractice. A leader should expose wrongdoing with careful evidence and a desire for restoration, not with blistering epithets designed to humiliate. The reality lies in the middle. Damina's language forces a public reckoning, and there will be consequences either way. If his claim exposes real patterns of exclusion, it can catalyze reforms, scholarship funds, revised governance, and restored trust. If his accusation is exaggerated or misdirected, it can needlessly wound reputations and distract the church from constructive solutions. Importantly, this moment raises a wider question about prophetic criticism in the church. What is the balance between needed prophetic confrontation and responsible, evidence-based accountability? The prophetic voice has a place, especially when institutions become complacent. But prophetic rebuke must ideally point to reform, specific actions that leadership can take to remedy the perceived wrongs. Bridging to reform, a practical pause. Before we close this section, it's useful to point to practical bridges between both sides of the debate. If the heart of the outrage is that sacrificial givers are bypassed by the very projects they funded, here are constructive steps institutions can take to diffuse the moral crisis. Scholarship endowments explicitly reserved for church members and low-income communities, funded from a portion of institutional revenue. Transparent reporting on how building funds were used, with accessible audits for contributors. Community quotas or reserved places at subsidized rates for descendants of founding members. Independent boards including member representatives to oversee mission alignment and pricing policies. Sliding fee scales and work-study schemes that enable talented but poor students to attend without incurring crushing debt. If these practical options are taken seriously, much of the prophetic heat that fuels Damina's rhetoric can be redirected into institutional renewal. Damina's words have cracked open a conversation the church urgently needs to have. The debate about Kumuyi and Oyedepo is not merely gossip about personalities. It is a moral conversation about stewardship, justice, and the proper ends of kingdom projects. The charge that leaders have built institutions members can't afford is serious, and it demands a serious response. Transparent accounting, intentional access for givers, and governance that balances excellence with equity. As we reach the heart of this debate, the question that refuses to be swept away by rhetoric or heat is simple and moral. Who should ultimately benefit from church projects built with the resources of ordinary people? This isn't a technical accounting question alone. It's a question about justice, stewardship, and the very nature of what it means to build for the kingdom. On one side of the argument are those who insist that church-owned schools have a mission that extends beyond the immediate membership. They say these institutions must aim to raise professionals, leaders, and change agents who will influence society at large. From that perspective, a university that charges market-competitive fees and admits a diverse student body is fulfilling a national calling. The logic here is straightforward. Quality costs, sustainability matters, and impact is measured in graduates, research, employment, and long-term societal transformation. If a church can create a world-class university that shapes the country's future, then that contribution ripples far beyond the giving plate. On the other side are thousands of small givers, parents, market women, civil servants, and artisans, who remember the repeated appeals for funds, the sacrificial gifts, the nights of fasting and pledges. For them, the moral expectation is immediate and personal. If I gave toward a school because I was told it would bless the church family, then that school should have arrangements to bless my household. The anger or disappointment you hear in voices like Abel Damina's is rooted in this felt injustice. People are not only speaking about affordability, they are speaking about recognition, inclusion, and honor. There is a deep sense that when the church builds something with its people's offerings, those people should not be the first to be excluded from its benefits. So where does justice lie between those poles? The honest answer is, it doesn't lie exclusively with either side. Justice here must be balanced with wisdom. It is possible, and necessary, to design church projects that both bring excellence and include the people who sacrificially made them possible. The question becomes a design problem as much as a moral test. Can institutions be architected so that excellence is financially sustainable while access for low-income contributors is guaranteed? Let's consider several practical models and ethical principles that can and should guide such decisions. First, every time a church embarks on a capital project, be it a school, hospital, or university, there should be transparent plans for accessibility embedded from the start. Those plans might include endowments seeded from the outset, scholarship quotas reserved in perpetuity for members' children, sliding tuition scales linked to income, or work-study programs that allow talented students from low-income backgrounds to finance their education while contributing to campus life. These are not exotic solutions. They are standard features of many philanthropic universities worldwide. What makes them revolutionary in some church contexts is the commitment to insert them into the founding documents and budgets so that the institution's mission remains tied to the membership, not divorced from it over time. Second, governance matters. When projects are launched with members' funds, the governing board should include representation from those who gave, not in a tokenistic way, but in meaningful oversight roles. This reduces the perception that leadership is building an elite playground for a different demographic. When contributors have a voice in how resources are allocated and how fee policies are determined, the trust deficit narrows. Governance is not merely administrative, it is pastoral. It is the institutional expression of the moral relationship between leadership and the people. Third, set clear expectations during fundraising. If a campaign is launched with the language of kingdom building, but the project will primarily serve a fee-paying cohort, that distinction must be made clear. Churches must avoid ambiguous appeals that invite sacrificial giving with implied promises of personal benefit that cannot be met. Honesty in fundraising reduces the grounds for later accusations of betrayal. Where ambiguity exists, leaders must err on the side of clarity and accountability. Fourth, measure impact beyond prestige. It's easy to display glossy pictures of new lecture theatres and campus inaugurations on social media and call that success. But a truly kingdom-minded metric would include the number of members' children admitted per year, the number of scholarships awarded to the poor, employment opportunities created for the local community, and the reinvestment of surplus revenue into community development projects. If the data show that the founding congregation benefits tangibly and sustainably, then critics lose their strongest argument. If the data tell a different story, reform becomes urgent and unavoidable. Fifth, build intergenerational and community partnerships rather than insular institutions. A school that partners with local public schools, runs outreach programs, and offers weekend classes or vocational training for community youth is more likely to be seen as a public good rather than an exclusive citadel. This shifts the narrative from us versus them to we are building together. These practical steps are not merely managerial niceties. They are moral actions that speak to the very soul of Christian stewardship. Church leaders who ignore them risk not only criticism but spiritual damage to their congregations. When people feel cheated or excluded, cynicism replaces faith, bitterness replaces generosity. That, more than any outside critique, should disturb the conscience of every pastor and leader. Now, let's confront the rhetorical flashpoint, the label Damina used, the phrase that shocked many and inflamed others. Names carry weight. When a respected brother calls another leader a Yahoo pastor, it is not just an insult, it is an accusation of spiritual malpractice, implying exploitation and moral corruption. Such language amplifies the debate, but it also forces a reckoning. There are two duties that flow from that reckoning. For the accuser, the duty to provide specifics and to propose reforms rather than simply condemn. For the accused, the duty to respond with transparency, humility, and clear remedial measures where necessary. If the accusation reveals real practices that are unjust, then swift, public reforms must follow. If the accusation is exaggerated or misplaced, the accuser must accept correction and pursue reconciliation. Either way, the church should resist the temptation to trivialize the conflict as mere gossip or to weaponize pastoral differences for social media attention. This moment should be an opportunity for mutual accountability, repentance where necessary, and structural reform where needed. Beyond policies and governance, there is a spiritual dimension to the question of who benefits. Scripture repeatedly insists that the heart of religion is to care for the widow, the orphan, the stranger, and the poor. When projects are conceived, the posture of the heart matters. Are we building to glorify God and bless His people, or are we building to glorify an institution and its visible successes? The Apostle Paul warned leaders about greed and the love of money. Jesus warned that those who seek to exalt themselves will be humbled. When the church embarks on grand projects, the posture of humility and sacrificial inclusion must be evident. So what should listeners, ordinary members, students, parents, and concerned citizens take away from all of this? First, be discerning. When your church launches a major project, ask for transparency. Ask for scholarship policies, governance documents, and plans for community inclusion. Second, hold leaders accountable with the same love that motivates prophetic critique. Healthy accountability is not hatred, it is care for the mission. Third, pray. This debate, sharp as it is, also calls the church to prayerful soul-searching. Leaders and members alike must appeal to God for wisdom, humility, and justice. As we round this discussion out, it becomes clear why Abel Damina's words touched a nerve. He opened a conversation the church must have, a conversation about stewardship, justice, and the ends of ministry. Whether you agree with his language or not, the questions he raised are legitimate and urgent. They call every leader to examine not only the sustainability of their projects but the equity of their designs. In conclusion, the controversy is not likely to end with a single sermon or a single rebuttal. These are structural questions that will require structural answers, scholarships, transparent governance, member representation, and clear impact metrics. For some, Damina is a prophet crying out for justice. For others, he is a divisive voice that stirs unnecessary conflict. The truth probably sits somewhere between those poles. What cannot be disputed is the moral imperative. If a church asks its people to build, it must build in ways that honor those people. If that mandate is embraced, the projects will not only be excellent, they will be just, and in justice the gospel finds one of its clearest testimonies. The unresolved question remains a good one to leave with listeners. When the church builds monuments of influence and learning, do they stand as altars of blessing for all who sacrifice for them, or do they become trophies for the few? That is the question the church now faces, and how it answers will shape not only public perception, but the integrity and witness of the gospel for years to come.